Hello and welcome to our weekly look at events inside Syria. I'm Adrian Finnegan. China's Vice Foreign Minister Jawan is in Damascus for talks. The visit comes after the UN General Assembly passed a resolution condemning ongoing violence in the country. Mr. Jawan has backed President Bashar al-Assad's plans for a referendum followed by parliamentary elections, but Beijing maintains it's against sanctions or military force against Syria. He's also meeting with Syrian opposition figures during his visit. And with the unrest continuing to brew within Syria, there are fears of external influence in the conflict. The Syrian government has accused foreign fighters, including members of al-Qaeda, of smuggling weapons into the country. Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri recently stated his support for the Syrian opposition. But some say that it's not like al-Qaeda to organize operations and not to take credit for them. Al Jazeera's James Bays sent this report from northern Lebanon, near the Syria border.
From northern Lebanon, we watch Syrian army soldiers on the other side of the border. They're trying to stop the smuggling into Syria of weapons and fighters. Even the Lebanese government is now claiming that among those who crossed illegally are members of Islamist groups, including al-Qaeda. The Syrian regime claims this man is the leader of al-Qaeda in Lebanon. Omar Bakri is a hardline cleric stripped of his UK citizenship, but he denies any involvement in the uprising in Syria and claims the latest video by al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri shows the group is not active inside the country.
What I see as an expert, there isn't anybody, even al-Qaeda themselves, they make it clear on the last message of Ayman al-Zawahiri, call people there, fight, stand for yourself, don't wait for anybody. If Al-Qaeda is there, they will do operations. They don't call people fight, because Al-Qaeda, their own actions, reach people before their own sayings. I mean, they do operations, and they came out and said, we did it.
Local people say the Syrian army have increased their patrols in recent days. But when you come to this border, it's marked here by the river, you see how easy it is to cross and how difficult it is to control. There are countless smuggling routes that have been used here for decades on a long and extremely porous frontier.
One expert says he has no doubt Islamist groups are among those infiltrating Syrian territory.
There are many ships from Libya, from the Gulf, from, of course, Lebanon. Iraq provides a lot of members of Qaeda. So they are in maybe 4,000 or 5,000, and this is not something to sniff at.
He says as the Syrian uprising becomes more militarized and continues to divide on sectarian lines, yet more Islamist fighters from abroad are likely to make their way to Syria, as they did in the past in both Iraq and Afghanistan. James Bays, Al Jazeera, Northern Lebanon.
Well, the Free Syrian Army is dwarfed by the scale of such a military operation, and the commander who defected from its ranks just 3 months ago has issued a new warning to foreign powers. He told Al Jazeera that while al-Qaeda is unwelcome, there's a danger that it could infiltrate the Syrian uprising if it goes on much longer.
We urge the international community to act as quickly as possible to solve the Syrian crisis, so as not to have a future where these organizations will have a part. Syria now, as a country, is losing control, and it is an open country, and this might lead to others seizing opportunities to enter a country that is out of control.
Well, for more on this, we're joined by our guests today in Washington, D.C., Walid Phares, an advisor to the anti-terrorism caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives. Walid's also author of The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. In London, Jawan Rashad, a member of the Syrian Social Club, who are a group of UK-based Syrians supporting government-led reform of their country. And joining us here in Doha, Louay Safi, chair of the policy office of the Syrian National Council. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Louay Safi, start with you first. Are extremists like al-Qaeda operating on the ground inside Syria?
Well, we have heard some of those claims from the Assad regime, particularly trying to defect some of the criticism that they were responsible for explosive in Damascus, and they say these were the work of Al-Qaeda. But in reality, you know, this revolution is continuing to be peaceful with the interjection of some elements from the Free Syrian Army who defected from the formal military forces.
Jawan, Rashad, when President Assad refers to the foreigners that his security forces are fighting across the country, is it Al-Qaeda that he's referring to, or extremists whose affiliations lie elsewhere?
From day one, when this crisis started in Syria, there were an armed militant and an armed element attached to the so-called revolution. However, at the beginning, the West did not shed the light on the element of the terrorism taking place in Syria. From day one, there were militant groups. There were jihadists in the entire Middle East fighting in Syria. And recently, I mean, not long ago in July, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of the Al-Qaeda, publicly announced and encouraged his fighter to commit a terrorist atrocities in Syria. Just a couple of days, they acknowledged again, and they took full responsibility. Even the United States government now, they acknowledging that Al-Qaeda atrocities taking place in Syria. What is ironic, and it's a new development in this crisis, that they publicly acknowledging what Syrians been saying from day one, that there are two folds or two scenarios taking place in Syria. And public uprising which took place in the very few days, and an armed element of that uprising, which obviously there are a lot of factors contributing toward that, an armed struggle, so to speak, or in Syria. Al-Qaeda, jihadists in the Middle East, and obviously well-trained group of militia being sponsored and being prepared very, very far, long time ago.
Walid Phares, the bomb attacks that we saw recently in both Aleppo and in December and January in Damascus, are they an indication that Al-Qaeda is at work in Syria? They do, or they seem to bear many of the hallmarks of operations carried out by Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Well, in the United States analysis of the phenomenon of Al-Qaeda in Syria, it has a history. Al-Qaeda was present in Syria before the revolt began. Number one, the regime itself had aided, not probably Al-Qaeda directly, but Salafi jihadists to cross from Syria into Iraq and fight with the insurgents in Iraq. So that element existed before. Two, an element allied to Al-Qaeda has crossed from Syria to northern Lebanon, Tripoli, in 2007. So those are two evidence that existed. What Washington argues with is the fact that while Al-Qaeda does exist in Syria and exists in every single Arab and Middle Eastern country as far as we know, is it really in control of the insurgency? Is it the one that is leading the insurgency? I don't think so. Washington doesn't believe that Al-Qaeda is leading, but believes that Al-Qaeda is trying to take advantage of the long-term crisis that exists today in Syria.
Louay Safi, to a certain extent, al-Zawahiri's statement this week makes perfect sense for an organization in need of a war. How much support does Al-Qaeda have among the Syrian opposition, and is there a danger that the Syrian uprising could be hijacked, spirited away from the various disparate Syrian opposition groups?
Well, Al-Qaeda is clearly a defeated, discredited organization, and mainly the Arab Spring came to just show that its own methods are rejected by the people in the Arab world and in Syria. So the uprising and the revolution in Syria started peaceful and continued to be peaceful for the first 6-7 months until the regime started to use its own military forces to suppress the uprising. Now, truly there were some militant elements, these paramilitary forces that were moving and attacking people and protests under the protection of the regime itself. But these are formed by the regime itself. It's not, part of the Al-Qaeda as far as we can tell. But I agree that, the Syrian regime has been using Al-Qaeda and facilitating the movement of radical elements that moved to Iraq.
Jawan, Rashad, I asked you a few moments ago about the foreigners that the President says are operating within the country. I know you want to come back on what Louay was saying there, but I want to put it to you that Iran and Hezbollah are perhaps also operating on the ground in Syria at the moment, working for President Assad.
May I just say a quick comment on what your Honorable Gassab just mentioned? Actually, it's not true. Syria has never supported any Islamic fanatic Salafist jihadist in the Middle East, as your guest portrayed, or tried to say, rather, or put it that way. Syria has officially and publicly acknowledged, and we make no secret of that, and we make no apologies of supporting our Iraqi brothers and sisters and their resistance and legitimate resistance fighting the American illegal occupation in Iraq. So does apply into Lebanon. We make no apologies for supporting and helping our Lebanese brother to defend the Israeli occupation of their land. There is a difference between legitimate resistance and Islamic fanatic, Islamic terrorists led by Al-Qaeda and the jihadists in the Middle East. Now, coming back to your question, does Syria really need the help of Iranian government or the few hundred of Hezbollah fighters? This is pathetic and laughable to say, to put it that way. Syria has more than 250,000 organized, well-trained army. They do not need the support of a few hundred supporters of Hezbollah to come and fight on its behalf. What is happening in Syria right now, it's obvious to everybody except those who have their political agenda by hiding behind the peaceful demonstration, and they try to hijack it. What is happening in Syria? Armed militia are fighting from day one. They try to destroy the Syrian infrastructure. They try to destroy the Syrian state as it is, and to suit their own political agenda. Syria is not fighting its own people. Syria is fighting the armed element and the terrorist militia and the terrorist gang who infiltrated Syria, coming from Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and so on and so forth. Okay. Not long ago. Okay. If you just may, just 1 second. Yeah. I mean, a lot of foreign fighters just have flown specifically from Libya to the Syrian border from the Turkish side to infiltrate and go and fight in Syria. I do not see this to be as a peaceful demonstration to topple the regime. This is a movement which it aims to destroy Syria.
All right, Walid Phares, I'll give you a chance to come in just a moment, but first let's go back to Louay Safi to answer that.
Well, I think, you know, what your guest from London is saying is laughable, because we know that the Syrian army, particularly the Assad forces, have been bombarding homes for the last 14 days. These are these are rocket launchers and artilleries that are bombarding the city. Are you suggesting that these are the Qaeda, these are the extremists that are bombarding the city?
Well, the Syrian army, let's be clear about it. Of course, innocent civilians do die in a military conflict. Let's be clear about that. And we do regret and we mourn every single citizen, Syrian citizen, who lose their life, whether they are from the opposition side or from the supporter side. They are all our brothers and sisters, and we wish them all well. The reality is that the Syrian army is fighting well-organized militia, well-trained, well-equipped, and they're fighting street battle. They have hijacked the entire town and cities. They have embedded themselves among the civilian deliberately to increase the numbers of the casualties among the civilians in order to blame it on the Syrian army. Of course, collateral damage will happen. Okay. When the army is fighting a street battle with the terrorists, of course innocent civilians will lose their life, and we regret the loss of every single life, no matter who they are, what is their background, or regardless of their political point of view.
All right, Walid Phares, what do you make of what you've just heard? Who else might be muddying the waters in Syria? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Hezbollah?
Well, these are players that are going to come and try to see if they have influence to exert. But let me go back to 2 quick points of history. The idea that the Syrian regime has never allowed jihadists from other countries, not just from Syria, to move into Iraq, that is a false idea. I mean, if you consult the newspapers in Lebanon 5 years ago and 4 years ago, there were interviews in Al-Nahar, Al-Safir, the other newspapers, with jihadists sitting in Tripoli with their picture and saying at what time the bus came and the Mukhabarat took us through the Hermel, through Syria, into Iraq. I mean, everybody knows it's open source that jihadists have been used by the regime to fight in Iraq, and that's their position. They wanted to fight the Americans or others, that's their position. Now, those networks that were used by the Syrian regime have turned against the Syrian regime now, and are going to be joining Al-Qaeda because they have assessed that this is the time for them to fight against that regime. But the second most important concept is that the Syrian revolution began as peaceful with demonstrations. We saw it. I mean, it's not satellite TV. We saw it basically with YouTube and elsewhere. Now, when the regime responded with violence, then you got two reactions. One is that the demonstrations grew bigger and larger. We saw them as well. And two, some of the soldiers and some of the elements of civil society in Syria started to use weapons to defend themselves. So what you have on the ground is demonstrations on the one hand, and then self-defense on the other hand. And now Al-Qaeda is coming into the fray because it took 1 year and the issue was not solved, so Al-Qaeda is going to intervene. And of course, yes, I agree, they may be Al-Qaeda coming from Libya or from Zanzibar because the crisis was not solved.
So if, in reaction to that, Walid Phares, the international community takes action in the light of this week's vote at the UN, to what extent would any foreign intervention by an international UN-backed force actually play into Al-Qaeda's hands?
It will play in, but let's be very clear. If it's fast, if it's overwhelmingly victorious, I mean the international community intervention, and if the Syrian people backs that change in Syria, Al-Qaeda will always be in any Arab country. I mean, look at Jordan. There is no civil war in Jordan, and there is and has been Al-Qaeda. Look at any other country, Morocco. It has an Islamist government now, and it has Al-Qaeda as well. Al-Qaeda is at the fringe, at the extremist fringe of the Islamist movement. In Syria, the large component of the Islamists are the Muslim Brotherhood, are some of the other Salafists. Al-Qaeda is probably 1% of that. It would continue to be in any Arab country.
Louay Safi, if extremists succeed in instigating an ever wider cycle of violence, with the Syrian army clamping down ever harder on the opposition, surely there comes a time when the only way to prevent a slide into full-scale civil war is to enter into negotiations with the regime. Is the Syrian opposition prepared to do that?
Well, before I answer this question, let me just state very shortly the facts of the essential facts of the situation. Now, the Syrian revolution is against dictatorship, and the demand is for democracy and human rights. The response for those demands, which were peaceful, were brutal attacks by the regime forces. Now, even as we speak today, the majority of the actions taken by the Syrian people are peaceful. Today in Damascus, in Al-Mazza, and in Al-Muhajirin, and many towns throughout the country, people are taking to the streets, not by using arms, but by using slogans and demanding change. Now, as far as the escalation of the violence, I think the regime is responsible. It started that violence by using certain forces and militias, and then now probably things could escalate unless we put a stop to that violence. I agree that maybe radical forces will come from other parts of the world to be part of the situation in Syria unless we take an action to stop the violence by the regime and its backers.
Jawan, Rashad, it seems that both the Syrian opposition and the Syrian government have a common enemy in the extremists. Why won't the government at least enter into talks with the opposition?
Well, that's what we've been saying from day one. Syrian crisis can only be resolved among the Syrians when the Syrians sit among themselves around the negotiating table and via dialogue. The only solution for Syrian crisis is a dialogue among the Syrian themselves without any foreign intervention. Syrian nation, all of us, we all are united in this legitimate demand. We all want democracy, we all want reforms, we all want end of corruption, we all want ballot box to be the ballot box to be the key to any power in Syria. Transitional, peaceful, president hand over to the next elected president, the elected parliament directly from the nation. That's what we need. Democracy is our demand. We are all Syrian united in this. Let's sit down together as a Syrian. Forget about our past. Forget about the grievances. Forget about our different point of views. Let's sit down and save Syria for the sake of Syrian nation. Forget our political interests, our personal views. Let's sit down. Dialogue is the only way forward for the Syrian to resolve and get out of this crisis.
Louay Safi, it sounds that he's being perfectly reasonable there.
Well, I mean, he sounds reasonable, but this is what happened. Initially, the revolution and those who were taken to the streets asked for reform. the response was bullets, was attacks by by snipers and by the regime militias. And the fact is that to have a negotiation, you have to stop the killing. As long as the regime is using its own forces to suppress peaceful demonstrations, you cannot, negotiate. I mean, this is this ingenuous, call for negotiation. How do you negotiate with a person who has putting a gun and putting it to your head? You can't negotiate with that person.
Walid Phares, is there a danger that the sort of attacks that we saw in Syria, in Damascus and Aleppo, could be extended by extremists to somewhere like Lebanon in an effort to stoke a wider regional sectarian conflict? And to what extent could the collapse of the Syrian regime, if it comes to that, allow extremists like Al-Qaeda a wide arena in which to operate? I mean, from Lebanon to Iraq. What are the dangers of that?
Well, absolutely. Al-Qaeda's plan is very clear, and they made it clearer and clearer with statements they're making, with chat room discussions. They consider the area located between the Sunni triangle in Iraq through all of Syria, almost practically, to northern Lebanon, the Bekaa, as an area of operations. So you've got to expect that they're going to try to increase their operations inside Syria. They're going to try to have bases of support and logistical support out of northern Lebanon, and if they can, out of Iraq, although it's more difficult. If the regime goes down, or if there is a much wider confrontation looking like a civil war in Syria, meaning forces controlling areas exclusively, then Al-Qaeda will act in Syria in the same way it acted in Iraq. I do not expect, though, that Al-Qaeda will be able to control the uprising, as is the title of the discussion today, because the uprising, first of all, is made of political forces, well organized, and then you have the Free Syrian Army, and then you have the international community. What Al-Qaeda can do is, the longer the crisis will go, it will widen its own cells, it will create trouble, it will create more trouble between the two parties. And one quick remark, if I may, on the regime offer to dialogue and discussion. Well, this has been the case since the beginning of the uprising last year, and we have, out of the Congress, at least in the European Parliament, asked that the Assad regime will actually do something very simple for that dialogue to happen, which is to create a national unity cabinet where you have half from the opposition and half from his regime, where you're going to withdraw the armed forces from the streets and allow people to demonstrate. If those issues would have been respected, then of course there would have been dialogue. But he is concerned that if he can allow the demonstration to continue, they're going to grow to a point whereby the legitimacy of his regime is going to be undermined, and that's exactly what has happened, unfortunately. We're
rapidly running out of time, gentlemen. Louay Safi, isn't the main challenge for the Syrian opposition now to ensure regime change, thus ridding the country of Iranian influence, but without opening the door to transnational jihadism and sectarian strife? How do you manage that?
Well, basically, we're not asking the war to change the regime in Syria. All we are asking is to protect the cities and to prevent the regime of using its artilleries and heavy weapons to kill basically civilians. I think the people in Syria are going to change the regime. This regime is going to be changed. The question is, are we going to allow the whole country into chaotic situation? I believe that inaction in Syria is more dangerous than action. And the international community must take responsibility and say Syrian military cannot use its artillery and heavy weapons to fight the protesters who peacefully asking for the rights and for democracy.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you to our guests for joining us today in Washington, D.C., Walid Phares, in London, Jawan, Rashad, and here in Doha, Louay Safi. And thank you very much indeed for watching. If you want to catch the show again online, just go to our website. It's at aljazeera.com, and do join us again next week for more Inside Syria from me, Adrian Finnegan. I'll see you again. Bye for now.